Nigel, just to introduce us, I thought I'd just remind you of the fact that we met, well, officially we met in Canada at the Perimeter Institute, but we'd been talking for quite a while before that because my work was basically trying to understand what universality is and how universality can be explained. And through the course of that and reading as much as I could on it, I came across this fantastic book written by you on the lectures on phase transitions and the Renormalization group, which I still think is one of the best books I've ever come across. And so, I mean, I want to thank you for writing the book, and thank you for all of the conversations that we've had. And then we can go on and talk about something.
Right. No, I mean, it was a great surprise and joy when Leo Kadanoff wrote to me and introduced us, and also Michael Berry,
Right.
And I was quite astonished to see that the work that we in the condensed matter physics community primarily had caught the attention of philosophers, and rightly so, and that you'd picked up exactly the right points that really indicated a paradigm shift between the view of explanations, physical explanations that had gone before, and what we were now doing. So I thought that was very prescient, and I also very much enjoyed your book too.
Thank you. Speaking of universality, we can talk about, it's been characterized primarily as identical or nearly identical behaviors in different systems. Why do you think it's an important concept? What's important about universality?
So universality is important for a number of reasons, I think. So the first reason is that if you know that a phenomenon has a universal explanation, that means that any purported explanation based on idiosyncratic details of the particular system under study is superfluous and misleading, because it makes you think that this behavior idiosyncratic behavior that you attribute to the explanation must be correct because it predicts the behavior that you observe. But if that behavior is universal, then that purported explanation could be completely wrong, but it may still be in the universality class of the actual explanation, and so you could have different explanations that have mutually contradictory premises, and they still produce the same universal behavior. So universal behavior is a sort of two-edged sword. It's important to be able to explain it because it precludes the wrong explanations. It's also important because once you know where universal behavior comes from and you know how to explain it, that leaves you free to separating out the details of the problem that are universal and the details that are idiosyncratic. And often you may want to focus on the idiosyncratic details if you're, a mechanical engineer or a material scientist or biologist or whatever it may be.
So sometimes what's important here is that there are different kinds of questions that can be asked. Sometimes what you're interested in are sort of detail-specific questions about a particular system in the universality class, and other times, if you gave an explanation of that type, it wouldn't help you at all in understanding why.
And I would argue that all the successful explanations that we have in physics are all universal explanations, because you can't know all the microscopic details all the ways down. So you can only have effective descriptions at some level, and you might be trying to understand, let's say, quantum electrodynamics, which is the most successful theory we have. You can make predictions of atomic phenomena that agree with theory to 7 or 8 decimal places. Absolutely phenomenal, unprecedented. But that theory, quantum electrodynamics, is absolutely not the correct theory of everything. It works at some range of space, time, and energy scales, and we know it is superseded otherwise. So I think we're always, when we're looking at physical phenomena, we're always looking at the universal phenomena at that level of description and then trying to isolate those things and explain them. And the fact that we can do that must mean that there are details to which the phenomenon is insensitive to.
Right.
And if those details exist and the phenomenon is insensitive to them, then that by definition is what constitutes universality. So I would argue that universality is the ultimate cause for our ability to have physical explanations of phenomena.
Okay, so in the recent discussions, both I think in the scientific and philosophical literature, there's been a lot of talk about the concept of emergence.
Right.
Oftentimes people cite, especially philosophers, cite the novelty of emergent phenomena, its unpredictability or unexplainability in terms of the underlying physical details or something like that.
Right.
What do you see as the relationship between this notion of emergence? Well, first of all, I guess, is that the correct way to think about emergence? And what do you see as the relationship between emergence and the notion of universality that we were just talking about?
Right. So I think the idea of emergence as something unexpected and so on, I don't agree with that, because the way, unexpected means, unexpected by whom or on what basis.
Right.
And let's give a simple example of the the most fundamental example of emergence, which is a simple magnetic system, where at low temperatures the magnetic dipoles, the spins, will spontaneously orient and provide a net magnetization. And that macroscopic net magnetization of a piece of iron, the magnetization, it's not something that's unexpected or can't be predicted. In fact, if I write down the simple model of it, I can exactly predict the behavior. I can't predict what temperature it's going to occur at. I can predict reasonably closely, but not exactly. But I can predict exactly how the magnetization emerges and all the other scaling phenomena associated with that. So I think it's wrong to say that it's not predictable. Now, of course, if you don't have a theory to work with, then you can't predict anything. But the whole purpose of physics, in my view, the way we operate is you start at one level of description, and then you use, let's call that a microscopic level, not the microscopic level, but a microscopic level, and then you try to go up one level of description to the sort of semi-macroscopic level and try to understand what happens there. So, you start off with particles bouncing around in a box. That's statistical mechanics. And then from that you can derive at some level of satisfaction thermodynamics from that. So that's the example of starting with a microscopic level and then going up to a level where all you see is heat flow and continua, and you don't even know that the atoms exist.
In fact, the theory of thermodynamics doesn't even make reference to any atoms.
The theory of thermodynamics was the first example of a top-down theory where people were really, really smart and figured out very sophisticated notions like entropy and so on, which I think would be challenging to interpret unless you have a lower level of description. But how does emergence relate to universality? So the point about emergence, we can predict what happens very close to the transition because we have a description of the physical system that is valid close to that transition point, and wherever that transition point occurs, with respect to that transition point, the phenomena can be predicted. So what I mean by that is I can't tell you exactly what the critical temperature, the nail temperature is at which a piece of iron will become a metal, although we can calculate it with pretty good accuracy. But I can tell you, if you look in terms of the temperature difference between the actual temperature and that critical temperature, how the various thermodynamic quantities behave. And that description doesn't rely very much on the microscopic details. Mm-hmm. So the technical description in Stat Mech is a Landau theory description, which is written down. It can be written down just by symmetry, just like you were saying in thermodynamics. And so we can use universality as the basis of our ability to predict emergence. And I think the other, we didn't really get to this, but I think it related to the emergence, which is the use of minimal models. So the other sort of consequence of there being universal behavior is that I have a plethora of models, all of which, if I solve them precisely, will predict the behavior that I want, the universal scaling behavior or the emergent properties. And what should a practicing scientist do? Choose the model that is the simplest to calculate with and analyze. And so you get the notion then of a minimal model, which is a description that might seem laughably simple, but because of universality, turns out to be a precise description. So, so as an example of the Ising model of magnetic phenomena. So I showed in my talk this morning that we can predict exactly the emergent properties, the magnetization as a function of external magnetic field and temperature. We see that it's universal. You can take data from many different materials, collapse them in the way that the renormalization group theory predicts. They all fall onto a universal curve. You calculate what that curve should be from the renormalization group and make all the appropriate systematic approximations, and it fits. It fits exactly. And that model that fits the data exactly is a model of a model of a model of a model of a model. Okay, you start off with quantum chemistry, then electronic structure, then quantum spins, and then classical spins, then Landau theory. Every step along the way is a non-systematic approximation. You can't justify it in the usual traditional way of saying, well, here's a small term so we can control it and expand. None of these there's no small parameter here. But because the phenomena are in fact universal, and there is in fact, that saves you. That means all the things that you couldn't calculate and systematize and are in fact turn out to be irrelevant. So you have to know, that the scientist has to know what's relevant and what's not. There's technique involved in doing that. It's not just hand waving.
Right.
But it means that you can make very simple and effective models. Another one that I want to mention is polymer chains. If you ask a very simple question, here's a polymer in solution, and it's just floating around, and you might say the configuration looks like some kind of random walk. All right, so you might ask the very simple question, if I know how many monomers there are on the polymer chain, how big is the polymer chain going to be? It's going to occupy some region of space. How big? Okay, so the chemist would say, all right, let's answer that. We know all the bonds, we know all the interactions between the carbons and the hydrogens and stuff like this, so we can look at all the rotational isomeric states, and then we can make many simulations of the rotation states and the bond angles and things like this, and we can, in principle, give me a big computer, I can give you a number, this thing is going to be, 3 microns big, or whatever it's going to be. The theoretical physicists would say, well, let's make a model. We'll just say this thing is just forget about the atoms. I don't care what they are, and I can't pronounce their names. But essentially, if I look at it from a long distance away, the polymer chain looks like a piece of spaghetti. So we'll just say it's a random walk. And if you do that, then you say that the size will scale like the square root of the number of monomers. That's the wrong answer. Okay. So then the physicist thinks again, and she says, aha, wait a minute. No two atoms can occupy the same point in space. Let's put that in. Okay? Then you get a model that says that because they can't occupy the same 2 points in space, you expect it to be slightly bigger, and it is. And you can use the renormalization group to work out what should be the size, and you find that the size should scale not as the square root power of the number of monomers, but the 0.588 power of the number of monomers. Okay, so that is the correct answer, and it's been verified experimentally. Now, why is one answer good and the other one bad? Well, the chemist's answer is, here's the size in microns or whatever you want. If you then tell the chemist, oh, actually, I told you it had, 10,000 monomers, I was wrong, it actually has, 150,000 monomers. They have to do it all over again.
Right.
The physicist just says, oh, it just scales by the ratio of those two numbers to the 0.588 power. So if you could tell me the size for one number, I can get it for the other. So both approaches are valid for answering different questions, so you have to decide what you really want to know. But our understanding of what controls the behavior at long wavelengths is that it's just spaghetti that can't cross itself.
Right. Well, I was going to ask about the role of the renormalization group in understanding emergence and universality. We've been talking a little bit about that already, but if you have any more to say about exactly how it's supposed to work.
Yeah,
that would be good.
What was revolutionary about the idea of the renormalization group was two things. One was that Leo Kazanov understood that as you change the scale at which you're trying to describe the system, your effective description has to change. And he even guessed how it should change and showed that could explain some of the universal phenomena that people already knew about. What Ken Wilson understood was how to actually turn that into a calculational tool, namely that as you look at larger and larger length scales, the Hamiltonian changes in a particular way, but at some point you have the idea that there are fixed points, certain specific types of model system, which really control all the behavior that you see. So in the normalization group language, that's fixed points, and the way that the Hamiltonian of the system changes on different scales flows in a way that you can quantify using dynamical systems theory, and so the idea of universality isn't just, well, there's some hand-waving waffly explanation that this could happen. It's an absolute certainty, and it explains how that can arise. So it also made a huge change in the way people think about fundamental physics, if you can call it that. So I'd say, when I was learning elementary particle physics and quantum field theory, people would write down the Hamiltonian for quantum chromodynamics or the electroweak theory or whatever it might be, and there was the notion that if you did all the integrals, this would explain everything. This was the theory, apart from gravity. And what the renormalization group perspective showed was that, in fact, these theories are just effective theories, valid at some particular scale of space, time, and energy, and they capture the physics there. And if you go beyond those scales, you will encounter new physics. Now, what was important was, at the time that I was learning quantum field theory, there was this idea of renormalizability as being a criterion for a physical theory. So this is what Feynman, Tominaga, and Schwinger won the Nobel Prize for showing that the infinities of the quantum theory of electromagnetism could all be absorbed into a finite number of parameters, and then you could do these fantastically accurate calculations. And so people were trying to find fundamental models of nature, electroweak theory, non-abelian gauge theories, and so on, saying the theories we should look for have to be renormalizable. And indeed, people got the Nobel Prize for showing Tufte and Veltman got the Nobel Prize for showing non-abelian gauge theories are renormalizable, and that led to the acceptance of the electroweak unification theory. But what we now know is that really is completely wrong. A theory that's always guaranteed to give you a finite answer, even when the theory is outside of its range of applicability, in my view, is not a very good theory. A theory that actually tells you when it is no longer applicable is a much better theory. Theories that sow the seeds of their own destruction are the theories that you want, because they tell you when and where you should find new physics.
Right.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion among a number of people about the difference between sort of being renormalizable in that sense and what the renormalization group can do in terms of determining what effective theories are and where they'll break down.
Right. The process of renormalization introduces a scale into your description, a renormalization point in technical terms, and the renormalization group is the extra realization that actually that scale wasn't there in the initial formulation of the problem. So how can it appear in the answer? And so there's a semi-group of transformations that are then generated by requiring the answer to be independent of that. So in a sense, what the renormalization group does is it takes an approximate solution of a problem, and then it says that the approximate solution should actually obey a particular kind of Lie group symmetry, which is the invariance under these approximation points, and then it improves that approximation, that perturbation theory. And so when you think of it in that way, then you can start to think of a renormalization group as divorced from quantum field theory and statistical mechanics, where it originally came from. And in fact, as you know from my book, you can then take the same perspective and apply it to the sorts of descriptions that we apply to matter that is purely deterministic, described by differential equations like in fluid mechanics and continuum mechanics. And so then we start to see an explanation of universality in everyday phenomena, not just those in high energy physics and you know, close to some complicated condensed matter physics critical point.
Right. So your background, as you sort of noticed, or as you said, was primarily in condensed matter physics, and that's what we've been talking about. How has that approach? I mean, and recently you've turned to biology in a very, very big way. How has your background in condensed matter physics influenced your approach to biology?
Right.
And the problems that you address.
Right. So I think first, to answer that, we should be clear about what condensed matter physics is, because it means different things to different people. So initially, people thought of it as, say, solid-state physics. Or Murray Gell-Mann used to call it squalid-state physics. Right? So that's the behavior of electrons in solids, and typically the band theory of solids, individual electrons each not noticing any of the others, moving independently and working out the band structure and the electronic structure of solids. But round about the 1960s, and again under the influence of many people like Phil Anderson, John Bardeen, and many others, people realized that really the interesting problems were ones where the degrees of freedom, the electrons in solids, but it doesn't have to be electrons, start to interact and you get collective behavior. And today I think we think of condensed matter physics as much broader than its roots in solid-state physics, but as the behavior of systems where there's strong interactions between the constituents, so that you don't really have the notion of individuality anymore, that what happens are collective shared properties that arise from those interactions, and indeed are emergent properties. And that means that you can think about condensed matter physics as describing, say, electrons in solids, or quarks in a quark-gluon plasma, or neutrons in a neutron star, which is superfluid. Mm-hmm. So all of these things, very vastly different length scales in physical systems, typically under very different categories in a physics department, you know, high energy physics, nuclear physics, solid state physics. Actually, they're all examples of condensed matter physics. So the essence then of condensed matter physics is collective behavior and interactions. Now, when someone like me starts to think about biology, you know, the first question you have to ask is, well, you know, what can you do that, you know, a biologist might not do and might not even think of doing? What kind of questions can you ask, and what kind of tools can you bring to bear on those questions? And biology is hard because it's so full of strong interactions between the components, between, let's say, individuals in an ecosystem, or between cells in an organism, or between the different proteins and nucleic acids and enzymes inside the cell, and so on and so forth, or even at another level of description, between genes themselves controlling the phenotype of behavior. So biology then is a problem of strong interactions, and many of those behaviors, many of the behaviors that arises from that are collective. And so the tools of condensed matter physics then can be taken over into biology. But you can't just sort of take them over and just sort of say, well, you just plug into the same old equation that we had in condensed matter physics. It's not like that. It's more that the perspective that you have and the questions that you ask and the routes to discovery that you employ, those are really instigated by condensed matter physics, and the problems that I work on are instigated by that. So, for example, many of my colleagues who are condensed matter physicists or soft matter physicists who go into biology They might be, say, trying to look at, I don't know, what are the forces that allow, say, some DNA to unwind during replication and things like that. Well, that's interesting, but it's a very baroque example of essentially F equals ma, and and it's important to understand, and there's a huge amount of ingenuity being applied to it, but it's not, from my perspective, fundamentally interesting. If on the other hand I'm, say, looking at, say, an ecosystem, and I'm looking at, say, the patterns of vegetation or the population dynamics of organisms as they interact with each other and compete for resources and prey on each other and so on and so forth, on large scales you see very clear patterns of organization in space and time and scale. And so those are the types of problems where it's very likely that collective effects appear. And then going back to the questions of universality. So one of the interesting questions in ecology is, what are the forces that structure communities? How do communities arise in the way that they do? And so one theory says, well, communities arise because they occupy some niche in the environment, a biochemical niche, or some resources, or population allows them to live in some particular area, something like that. So that's an area where there's basically a lot of selection that goes on to create the community. But there's another theory that says, well, how do you know it's not just random fluctuations? I mean, you go to an ecosystem, you go and measure the most abundant species. Okay, it's giraffes. The next one is hippopotamuses. The next ones are squids. The next ones are penguins. Okay, so you say, well, why should the giraffe be more abundant than the others? Okay, you could look for an idiosyncratic explanation, but let's face it, something has to be the dominant one, something has to be the second most numerous one, and so on. If it was just at random, what pattern of abundances would you expect to see amongst those different species? And so you have now two potential explanations. One based on the reason you see giraffes is because there's the sort of food that giraffes eat, and that's why they're the most abundant in the organ. And the other is that it's just a random fluctuation. You go and look at what those two theories predict, and they're very, very hard to differentiate. Okay, so there's papers in Nature that will say, here's the theory, and random theory knows nothing at all about what the organisms are. It's the ultimate spherical cow theory of ecology, and it produces the same predictions as what you observe and what you would expect based on there being some biologically relevant niche. So two types of theories: one that says the organisms have some specific functionality, the other that says all the organisms are spherical cows, functionally equivalent. They give results that are indistinguishable. That's and there's a theoretical explanation for that, and at least under some circumstances. So that's an example of how good universality is. We can predict this, so that means we can sort of predict how many species are going extinct today in the Amazon rainforest, because we can extrapolate these formulae. On the other hand, because it seems to be at least quasi-universal, not universal in the RG sense, but sort of universal in the sense of the results are insensitive, then it means that we can't, by looking at a static pattern, we can't then infer something about the dynamical process that structured the community. So anyway, so that's a long-winded answer to your question of how the condensed matter viewpoint can influence the way you do biology.
Well, that's certainly fascinating. I know we could go on for a long time, but
we've got plenty of time.
Yeah. Well, so can you describe a little bit about the work on universal biology that
sure
that you've been doing?
Yes.
Because that's not exactly.
We haven't covered that, and
Yeah.
I think it's very important. So what I've been talking about so far, at least with regards to biology, is essentially how physicists would look at the same biological questions that a biologist might ask, and not become a biologist with better math skills, but use different techniques and ways to understand it. But now I want to ask a different question, which is, I want to quote Stanislav Ulam, who was one of the developers of the hydrogen bomb. He had the original idea for how hydrogen bomb should work. He was a mathematician at Los Alamos, and he had this lovely quote. He said, "Ask not what physics can do for biology, ask what biology can do for physics." Okay, so I want to answer that question, okay, because I think it's a very interesting one. So as a physicist, so it's not that I sort of dropped physics and said, well, to hell with physics, and I'm going to go and do biology. There's more money there, it's more exciting, and let's just go and do that. No, one of the reasons that I study biology, apart from its intrinsic interest, actually, let me be clear about this. My intrinsic interest in biology is essentially zero. Okay, I don't care about how many legs some beetle has, or what its mating habits are, or any of those things that traditionally made people interested in biology. I'm interested in it primarily because it's a fantastic problem in physics, and I think it's important to talk about that. So that's how I'm going to interpret your question.
That's actually how I meant it.
Yeah. So I think that the physics question that biology presents is this: we can understand many of the phenomena in the universe, but when we understand a phenomenon, what do we mean by understanding? So the example I like the best is superconductivity. So in superconductivity, there's two things. We first of all understand at a microscopic level how superconductivity arises in certain materials, so-called weak coupling superconductors, the classic superconductors known before about 1985, 86, something like that. We could describe this very well with the Bardeen-Cooper-Schrieffer BCS theory of superconductivity in terms of the interactions between electrons and sound waves, phonons in a solid. But we also understood superconductivity in another way. We also understand that superconductivity arises because of a special kind of symmetry breaking. That symmetry breaking is called off-diagonal long-range order, and any time you have a quantum condensate which exhibits off-diagonal long-range order, and that condensate is charged and coupled to a gauge field like the electromagnetic field, then you get the phenomena of superconductivity. You get the persistent currents and many other things, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there's two levels. One which is a sort of top level, which is a symmetry-based picture. One which is a lower level, which is a detailed model of how the constituents actually instantiate the phenomenon of superconductivity. Now, if you look at the history of superconductivity, what you find is something very surprising. Superconductivity was discovered in 1911 by Kamling-Onnes, and that was the phenomenon of material which has a zero resistance. Okay, that's great. And then about 20 years later, it was discovered, oh wait, there's more. Superconductor expels magnetic fields. It's called the Meissner-Ochsenfeld effect. Okay, so that's great. And another 20 years, and then, oh wait, there's more. There's actually two types of superconductors. There's ones that can expel magnetic fields. There's ones that can have quantum vortices thread through the lattice, and thread through it in a lattice, and that's the Abrikosov or type 2 superconductors. And wait, there's more, because about another 10 years after that, the Josephson effect was discovered, or actually predicted and then observed experimentally. So the question is, why was it that it took so long to understand all these phenomena associated with superconductivity? Well, you might say, well, superconductivity is very complicated, it's very hard, it's not surprising it took people a long time to realize these things, or to measure them, or to predict them theoretically. But it's not true. If you look at the symmetry level description of superconductivity, the top level, the phenomenological level, off-diagonal long-range order plus gauge symmetry, within a few lines of algebra, you can derive all of these phenomena. If people had had that viewpoint in the early 1900s, they could have predicted all these things 50 years ahead of time. But people didn't, because they were looking at this lower level of description. So in summary, our understanding of superconductivity is we understand why the phenomenon exists and what constitutes the major aspects of that phenomenon, the universal aspects of that phenomenon. And that's the off-diagonal long-range order plus gauge invariance symmetry description. And then we understand at lower levels of description, microscopically, how this phenomenon is instantiated in particular materials. And in fact, in the high temperature superconductors, we don't have that second level of description. We do not know what happens microscopically with those materials. But we do know that they obey all the phenomena from the top level description, so we can still probe superconductivity and try to understand it. So that's what we mean when we say, as a physicist, we understand something. Now let's look at biology, and now let's ask, how do we try to understand life? So I would argue that the way that we as a community, biologists and physicists studying biology, are studying life is really at the lower level description, the description in the level of instantiation that, say, people were studying superconductivity all that time. And we understand the different components inside living organisms and how they interact, and we understand a lot about the chemistry and so on and so forth. But we don't understand the answer to a very simple question, which is, why does the phenomenon of life exist at all? Why does matter self-organize into structures that are hierarchically organized and evolve, and indeed evolve complexity in an open-ended way? Why didn't life start with some molecules, say RNA world, which I don't happen to believe in, but let's say that, and then once you've got some self-replicating slime, why didn't it just stop there? Why did it evolve all the way to us, for example, and presumably beyond at some time? So we don't really understand the answers to those questions. Now, you could say, well, the reason we don't understand the answer to those things is, first of all, it's very speculative, and B, what use is it? Okay. And my answer to that is it would be incredibly useful. So let me go back to my condensed matter physics analogy, superconductivity. So in what the top level description of superconductivity enables, the off-diagonal long-range order, the breaking of symmetry, gauge theories, what that enables you to predict is what is the response of a superconductor to a magnetic field. What is the response of a superconductor to an electrical field? In the case of the Meissner effect, or type 2 superconductivity, or the Josephson effects. So understanding the top level of description enables you to understand how the system responds to various types of perturbations that it can be subject to. Now, when we look at biological systems, we want to perturb them, because you could say, why do we spend, whatever it is, $30 billion in the US every year for the NIH? Well, because we want to improve health, and we want to, and then in other agencies we want to improve, crop yields and prevent pests from, weeds interfering with our crops, or pests spreading malaria, and all these sorts of things. So we definitely want to intervene in biological systems. We want to cure cancer. We want to be able to stop cancer cells spreading. So we ought to be able to control systems, and control means you apply some perturbation to a system and then you make it do what you want. So when we look at biological systems and we ask, how successful have we been at that endeavor? The answer is remarkably unsuccessful. Let's talk about bacterial infections. You have a bacterial infection, they can be deadly. Okay, a sore throat can kill you, but not anymore. Because we have antibiotics. If you go to the doctor, they see you've got strep throat, give you antibiotics, everything's fine. Except not so fast, because now those antibiotics don't work anymore. Well, many of them don't. There's now diseases, TB, gonorrhea, and so on, which are resistant to the antibiotics of last resort. And this is a trend that has been happening ever since antibiotics were introduced. Yes. So what you learn from that is the evolutionary timescale in this case is not millions of years, it's decades, less than a decade. Okay, same thing with weeds. You try to stop weeds growing with Roundup so that you can improve, have a high density of crops in your fields and so on and so forth. Okay, now weeds are resistant to Roundup. Same thing with insecticides, herbicides. Why can't you cure cancer? You give a chemotherapy agent to a patient, and unfortunately the tumor very quickly evolves to respond to that, and becomes resistant, and so the cancer spreads. So what we learn is that there seems to be another universal aspect of universality, a universal property of biological systems, is that the way that they respond to perturbations is not the same way that physical engineered systems do, which is a physical engineered system, you bend it and it restores itself, Hooke's law. Biological systems don't do that at all. They change the rules by which they operate. And so whenever you apply a perturbation, all it does is it makes the system evolve to somewhere else where you can't reach it. And so you have this problem. This is a universal aspect of living systems. It's some epiphenomenon of evolvability. And you have the question, is it possible, even in principle, to control an evolvable system? And if so, how? And in fact, some of my research has been directed to trying to answer that question. What should be a methodology that can really, model what happens in a biological system? In my particular case, I was studying bacterial infections. And the usual approach is you've got a bacterial infection, hit it with antibiotics, kill all the bacteria, and then hopefully you'll be fine. That's a really bad thing to do. What we studied was look at a bacterial infection as an ecosystem. And the ecosystem consists of the bacteria. It consists of the pathogens. It consists of how they talk to each other. It consists of how they interact with the resources that they need, which is the epithelial lining of your gut, for example. It consists of how they interact with other microbes, the bacteria that are beneficial in your gut and are already there. And all of those things interact in some way, and then you have to also look at the metabolism of the pathogens. And so what you learn is that actually you can try to find the least evolvable points in the ecosystem of a bacterial infection, and those should be how you do your target. And so we've done some theory of that, and what I hope to do in the future at some point is be able to try to test these ideas out in vitro and then ultimately in vivo. So at least this perspective actually is a constructive one if one wants to do bioengineering in one way or another. So we don't really understand why the phenomenon of life exists, and we don't really understand what is the response function characteristics of dynamical systems that can literally change the way they behave as a result of their environment. And so that's very different from physical systems.
Right.
So it's a whole. So biology is part of physics. It's a physical world, but it's behavior that is not the sort of traditional behavior you expect of physical systems. Biological systems are a whole new realm of dynamical systems, and I think that's what's fascinating about them.
So if we were to have an analog of the upper level description of superconductors, which would be essentially, I take it, a theory of life, or what makes something alive, I suppose, then your task might be easier.
It would be
or at
easy.
least it would be directed.
It would answer two things. It would tell you how to think about the system more, which is what I've said,
right.
But it would explain what is needed to understand the open-ended growth of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question could be very interesting, because the question here's a question that everybody's fascinated by. Are we alone in the universe? So one way you can answer that question is you can go out to other planets or send robots there and look for other life. But there's another way we can understand the answer to that question, which is if we really understood life and how and why it arises, we could understand, is it an inevitable consequence of the laws of physics expected to occur in any planetary environment which has a sufficient number of disequilibria that there is thermodynamic conditions required for life to exist, or is it something very special, some chemical accident? My prejudice is that it's not a chemical accident, that it's an inexorable consequence of the laws of physics. So when we think about, because we understand, say, the laws of fluid mechanics, we know that if we, say, look at the liquid oceans on the surface of Titan, we know that the atmospheric winds on Titan will cause there to be waves. And those waves, we can calculate precisely their amplitude and their wavelength, and we can go and look for them. We know they should be there, and in fact, they were observed by Cassini. In fact, there was a time when there was some sort of worry in the scientific community these waves should be there, and we don't see them. Well, it turned out to be an observational problem, and a few years later they were detected. So we knew they had to be there because we understood the physics. So if we understood why life occurs at all, then that would tell us, well, okay, life is inevitable. You should expect to see it in the ocean floor of the global ocean of liquid water that lies under the ice caps of Enceladus or Europa or Pluto. It should inevitably be there. The matter should self-organize, and this is something that we can be confident about. And then you would know that, it's not the same thing as detecting life for itself, but at least you would have a scientific basis for saying we should be looking for life, because it really should exist, because we understand why. And at the moment we don't. We can't really say that. It's just a fishing expedition.
Okay. Yeah. So our discussions here and in the past has always struck me it struck me how deeply philosophical you are, in a sense, in how you approach problems in physics and in biology. And so here's a kind of off-the-wall question. Can sciences and physics and biology in particular learn something from philosophy of science?
So
what is your view about that?
I think we can, because I think for me the process of philosophy of science is really, I mean, you think about it in a very deep way compared to the way that I do, but from my perspective, what we're doing when we're thinking about what you call the philosophy of science is we're thinking about what should be the research strategy we should be using to uncover knowledge about the world. And if you're not conscious of that process and of the choices you have available, then you will just sort of reinvent the wheel and do the simplest naive possible thing. So let me give you an example of that. In biology, if you ask a biologist, how can we explain this, make some predictions? Well, you might say, let's make an all-atom simulation. Take every atom, we know where they all are from crystal structures, solve the equations of motion, and you can do remarkable things that way and make predictions. And that's one thing you could do. But it has limitations for obvious reasons in terms of computer power and so on, and it doesn't necessarily give you an answer that you can simply interpret and understand and then generalize. Most disciplines, say, that I've worked in, biology, material science, fluid mechanics, they're unaware in general of the deep roots of universality and emergence and all of these ways that we can use to understand nature. And so I think by being a bit more conscious about the process of how we do science, what modeling strategies we choose, where we choose to make our levels of description, then we can ask questions in perhaps a better way, and that can move our understanding forwards.
Great. Well, this has been a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Okay.